welcome to sit down. Right, hello and welcome to our event today. This is part of the Together for Transparency series of events that are happening during Bonn. We're covering today a global stocktake for non-state actors, how to drive accountability and action, which is very relevant considering that the accountability framework that came out at the weekend, which we'll be obviously interested. We will open it up to questions at the end, so we'll be interested to get some of your thoughts on that and reflections, and also we'll get them from the panel as well in relation to that. So my name is Bez Cornaby. I'm Director of Policy and Systems Change Collaborations at CISL, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, where I lead our UK and international policy work. I also lead on business collaborations for systemic change on nature and climate. I'm delighted that we have a number of partners who have been involved in pulling together this event, so Climate Chance, CDP, Climate Action Network France, and the World Benchmarking Alliance. And also we will today have a speaker from the COP28 presidency as well. As has been in many discussions already this week, transparency is very important, and the role of business in that is also incredibly important, because over the last few years, a number of them have been making commitments and pledges, and what we need to see is actually those being delivered, but in a way that is, transparent and that keeps them accountable for what they're doing. There are a number of different themes that we're going to cover during this session, some of which I've put up here, and we hope to be able to explore some of those with you as well towards the end. And really what we want to do through this session is demonstrate the relevance of the global stocktake to non-state actors, especially companies. Some of that will look at, some of the UNFCCC process, but also kind of what can happen beyond there as well in terms of business action. Just to give a bit more of an introduction to myself and where I'm coming from and actually how we work with business on this. So we've got 4 different areas that we work with on at CISL: foresight, education, convening, and innovation. And the key one that relates to our work here on policy is around convening. And that is where we convene business leaders, policymakers, academia, and what the solutions that are actually needed and helping to drive the change at the systemic level in terms of actually how we shift the economy. We do this through a model that uses the ambition loop. This is where we see increasing business action, and business ambition can drive government ambition, and this is a reinforcing loop that can end up raising ambition on both sides. We do that at a national level and a regional level in terms of we have 2 corporate leaders groups, CLG UK and CLG Europe. We also do this globally through bringing together other national level business groups and actually connecting them up to actually support them in terms of catalyzing that business leadership at a national level in terms of actually the climate advocacy that they're calling for. And the aim of that is to raise ambition. Transparency is obviously a key part of this because we want to see businesses that are leading being able to talk about what they're doing, sharing the examples with government, and being able to talk about the barriers and the enablers in an open and honest way. So this brings me through to our first speaker, and just to say, I'm just going to do, we also have the panel coming up. All of our speakers are actually listed up there at the moment. But first of all, I'm going to hand over to Sabrin, who is going to talk about actually why this is important to the COP28 presidency, and particularly the role of corporates in.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me here today, and I'm very pleased to be joining you to speak a little about the UAE presidency's approach to COP28, as well as how we hope to engage with and collaborate with non-state actors and the private sector. As many of you know, the Global Stocktake is set to conclude at COP28, which means that this year's conference holds particular significance. It really is a chance for the global community to review, revise, and most importantly, recalibrate. And it's a chance to broaden our engagement in a way that's never really been done before, to ensure that stakeholders, especially non-state actors, are fully and equally engaged. We know that climate change is a global problem which requires global actions from all sectors, from all geographies. And as Beverly mentioned, while national governments have led the way in many fronts in formulating and adopting the Paris Agreement, non-state actors are essential if we are to build a sustainable, climate-resilient, nature-positive future for all. In short, Paris gave us the agreement, and COP28 has to deliver tangible actions. And this includes clear and demonstrable progress on mitigation, on adaptation, on loss and damage, and on finance. And on mitigation alone, the scale of the challenge is huge, and we need to be fully aligned as a community if we are to have any chance of bringing 1.5 degrees within reach. A global transition to net zero calls upon a complete transformation of economies. We need to systematically change the way we work, the way we consume, and the way we operate. Non-state actors are indispensable allies in this process because they are force multipliers and real economic and social agents of change in making this possible. And without active participation and ownership of this process, we'll only make incremental progress with limited, credible pathways to success. So, as I said earlier, it's really time to ramp up our aligned action. The Global Stocktake, in many ways, is the biggest exercise in accountability. And we have to be forthcoming and candid about progress, setbacks, and chart a path forward together. With a growing number of non-state actors committing and pledging to achieve net zero, it's time for that to become a lot more transparent. Pledges must be transparent. They need to be accountable. And we need to be able to have that honest conversation about what are the key barriers that need to be unblocked to move forward. Without accountability, promises can undermine our collective action. And if we are to really continue making any progress, we need to ensure that that is addressed, because this has been particularly challenging for vulnerable countries who are already bearing the brunt of the worst impacts of climate change. Accountability has to begin with transparency. That's the first step, but it also has to be followed by concrete actions on a yearly basis. And that's where non-state actors can really demonstrate credible leadership by not only adopting sustainable practices, but also in how they invest, how they operate, how they transition to a low-carbon, net-zero, resilient business model and way of working, irrespective of sector, geography, or state of maturity of the organization. We're finding it very encouraging that non-state actors are already so engaged with us and are very active in demonstrating how they can bring value to the Global Stocktake process, which is really demonstrating to us also the value of multi-stakeholder engagement, but also how together we can bridge the emissions gap. Under the UAE's presidency, COP28 aims to be a COP of action and a COP for all. We are committed to driving an inclusive process that brings everyone to the table, particularly the private sector. We know that the private sector contributes a significant proportion of greenhouse emissions, but at the same time, the private sector also possesses massive financial resources, talent, and capabilities. And we need these resources to make meaningful change, especially as we deploy new technologies and transition faster than ever before. We hope at COP28 to enhance integrity, transparency, and accountability across all non-state actor tracks. And we hope that today and at the Climate Change Conference at Bonn, it really is that defining moment where we are collectively really stepping up our discussions on accountability. I know that it's come into the focus over the weekend and it will continue to be a topic of discussion. But we do need to come together to talk about what is practical, what is scalable, and what is applicable across all geographies and sectors, as I said before. This is a race and every step forward counts, and we hope that we will remain engaged with you all, and we would like to hear as to what the opportunities are, what the barriers are, and how we can come together collectively to ensure that at COP28 this November, we are able to have meaningful conversations that do follow on to future COPs but also allow us as a global economy to come together in a way that we never have before. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sabrin. And I think there is still so much to do actually as we head to COP28 and we actually get there in terms of actually, bringing the private sector along and actually looking at, that, how do we, what is that accountability mechanism and actually, looking at that framework and actually how that applies to the private sector. So we look forward to continuing conversations on that. I'm now going to turn to our panel and introduce them in turn, and they are each going to present in terms of some of the work that they've been doing and actually particularly engaging corporates, but also in other ways with different non-state actors as well. So I'm going to go to Marine first, who in her current role is focusing on accountability for state and non-state climate action and international climate politics, and she's going to talk about why the global stocktake is vital to civil society.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Beverly said, I'm Marine Pouget. I am working for the Climate Action Network France, and I am also following very closely since 2 years now a very important matter for this year, the global stocktake. So what I would like to do in the 5 minutes I have is to explain to you what civil society thinks about this stocktake and why this is so vital for us. This is not just an exercise in the UNFCCC sphere. It's actually a matter of life because the global stocktake is about to go on track to the 1.5 scenario, and it means saving cultures and saving species and saving lives. So this is really about protecting people. That is what the GST is about. And we know we don't have so much time to stay on the come actually to the 1.5 scenario as the IPCC is telling us. So this GST this year is crucial because the next one is in 2028 and it will be almost too late actually to go on this trajectory. So that's why this year is so exciting. We have a chance to respect the Paris Agreement's goal. Here we go. So as I said, this is important in terms of protecting people, but it's also the accountability mechanism of the Paris Agreement. And if it is a failure, we won't have another 5 years to correct the trajectory we are in. So first, before going to our priorities in terms of what we think the global stocktake should recommend, we have some principles where we think this is the only way this process would be successful. You can see them on the slides. The first one is to be inclusive, and that is what it has been so far. I don't know if you're familiar with the process, but there are several roundtables, world cafes, discussions happening in the global stocktake world, and everyone can take part of it, which is really nice. And as a representative of civil society, I can say this is not happening on all items in the UNFCCC sphere. And it's very important because all stakeholders, including universities, cities, companies, banks, everyone is a key actor to implement the Paris Agreement. And that's why the GST must be so inclusive, because we all have something to say about how we can enhance ambition for the next years. Next, inclusivity, I would say that it has to be evidence-based, use the best available science, and also show the best solutions we have, and prevent us from distraction or false solutions, as we call it. And the last principle would be to be balanced. It means to have geographical balance between northern and southern countries, but also between several stakeholders, that we don't have too much representativity, for example, of one sector but not another. And we just want to be sure that all the pillars of the Paris Agreement are touched by the global stocktake, which are mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, means of support, capacity building, technologies transfer, and cross-cutting issues. That doesn't sound very important, but these are the human rights protection, these are the ecosystems protection, gender equality, or protection of the rights of the children and young people. So all of this is very important if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement. And let me finish by coming back on what we are expecting next to how the process should be. We just talked about the framework, accountability framework from the UNFCCC, and that's actually something that we see as an interesting way to continue after the Global Stocktake or reflection on accountability. And so it's nice to have it already now because we can prepare it, and I know there will be some consultations around it, so probably COP28 will bring new measures or new elements on this framework, which is very new, but we have to move to the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement, and for that we need to see in the UNFCCC sphere how we work together for this. We are still on a very negotiation focus, which is necessary because it's a party-driven process, but we need also to discuss together on how to implement it. And the GST provided some new format, as I was explaining before, where we all can talk together. And it's not just a negotiation room where observers are waiting and sitting. So I think this is an interesting thing to take forward after the GST, to see how the UNFCCC can work maybe a bit differently to really address implementation and not only negotiation. And next to that, on non-state accountability, I think everything is in the framework, most of it. We think that we have some portals on the UNFCCC, such as the Global Climate Action Portal, if you're familiar with it. So we think the GST should give a clear mandate to the high-level champion teams and the teams who are working on this portal to be able to really conduct that work of tracking and creating transparency in the UNFCCC sphere for the coming years. And this is not just to create, what does that mean, create transparency? It's about showing what are the best solutions. We have a lot of actors outside who have solutions, but we don't see them, we don't hear them. So this is also about really bringing the great examples, and it's also preventing from greenwashing, because greenwashing is actually a huge threat to the UNFCCC space right now. And I think we all know that. So we have a few years maybe to use the GST outcomes to prevent that the most we can. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm giving back the floor to you, Beverly.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Very nice. I think some really good points that we'll explore a bit further through the discussion. So we're now going to hand to Joachim, who's from World Benchmarking Alliance, and he's going to be talking about developing conducive policy environment and aligning company transition plans with sectoral pathways and NDCs.
Thank you. Thank you, Beverly. It's great to be here and to be talking a little bit more about what we do at the World Benchmarking Alliance and how it relates to the GST. Next slide. So briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar, essentially at the World Benchmarking Alliance, we look at how what we call keystone companies are aligning with the SDGs in a broad way. So thus, we have different benchmarks. But in the climate and energy team, what we really look at is two key aspects. So both on the climate and on the social side, the credibility of the transition plans of these companies. So the companies, Keystone, those are mostly multinational with high amounts of revenues. And we developed a number of benchmarks for different sectors that are listed here. And for the climate component, and it's all publicly available information, what we really try to see is how companies are comparing against each other on a number of criteria that are important for assessing the credibility of these transition plans. So that, I think, is really important when we talk about non-state actor accountability, that we're not only focused on one aspect, because it can be easy to think that this is what accountability is, but then while our scores tend to be lower, they also show, I think, that the whole pathway of how companies can get there. So that includes a number of factors, and I won't go into the whole methodology, and I can answer questions later, but looking at the management side, the investments, the targets they set, and so on, how they engage with suppliers, for example. Another key aspect, I think, and that would be interesting to discuss in the context of the GST, is also the equity dimension, specifically how the private sector is operationalizing the ILO guidelines. And I think here there are examples of best practice, but still a number of gaps as well. And I think particularly one of the gaps that comes up is just transition planning. So through our methodology, what we have done is to break down the ILO guidelines into a number of indicators to see how are companies actually disclosing the stakeholders they engage with, whether that's unions or communities, how meaningful is that engagement? So for each of these indicators, we look at really specific criteria. And there's also core social indicators that are also related in terms of human rights due diligence, for example. So very briefly, to give you a sense of the scores, essentially, I think that maybe this is also does not come as a surprise, but we see, relatively speaking, and some of this data is also being updated regularly. But for electric utilities and automotive companies, the transition is relatively more mature or accelerating. Again, relatively speaking, as we know, in terms of the increasing market share of EVs or the increasing amount of investments that go in solar PV. But in other sectors, where there's still a very long way to go, and I think key areas for improvement would include setting targets, for example, for Scope 3, despite, of course, the difficulty in doing that, because, of course, that accounts for the majority of emissions. For some of the companies, there's really the need to engage with suppliers, and I'm thinking especially in terms of buildings and transport, there's really, this accountability is diluted along the value chain of who are the companies that are accountable, and also for the reporting, is it the construction companies, or is it the property managers or developers? So that's still something that is challenging. And also in terms of the investments, just to give an example for oil and gas, there's really an opportunity, I think, in the current context to invest significantly more in something that we're still not seeing despite some progress for some companies. So you can see here, just briefly, the scores for just transition. Again, electric utilities comes out as higher performing because the discussion has also a lot been focused on coal. And when you look at other sectors, there's still a gap in terms of discussion, despite some initiatives that exist. So I'll just conclude in terms of what are our messages in terms of recommendations for the global stocktake to have more weight politically. I think the first one is taking into account the types of data that is being reported, for example, in terms of GCAP or efforts that are being done with NZDPU, because not all the data is equivalent. And as we know, some methodologies will be maybe more opaque on how companies are being benchmarked or rated. So I think there's really an effort here to make sure that the data is of the highest quality possible and that this informs the GST. The second point would be that there's been a lot of engagement with non-state actors, as we know, in terms of the race to zero, and there's also been the updated criteria, but we're still not seeing the implementation side that is fully taken place. So this is still something ongoing, as was mentioned earlier with the UNFCCC that is looking into how to operationalize the H-leg recommendations that are, of course, extremely ambitious. But I think that even if the level of ambition is not as high as it should be, there should be, the discussion should focus into implementation phase, and we should start discussing about that. Thirdly, I think it's important that the discussion about non-state actors is also incorporated into the enhanced NDCs that will be released in 2025. And so specifically looking at what kind of targets will be set for non-state actors, and that the NDC, that the transition plans are also locally specific in terms of aligning with reduction targets mentioned at NDCs and also sectoral pathways. And finally, two last points. I think there is a bit of a carrot and stick maybe strategy for having higher accountability from non-state actors. Of course, it's important that governments set incentives or subsidies to see increased investments in renewables or clean energy in general. But also, I think there's a call to have more legislation and regulation to actually force somewhat these companies to start implementing these transition plans. So there's been a number of legislation globally on mandatory disclosures, and they they need to be context specific. But I think that legislation is also really important, and we can talk about later today. And finally, the equity point I think is key as well. We see from our data that companies performing better on climate are not the same necessarily performing well on just transition and social side. So this cannot just be an afterthought, and especially through the value chain, there needs to be more accountability about what are the impacts companies are having. So I'll just conclude there, and thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joachim. We're now just going to keep moving through. So we're going to hand to Amir from CDP, who is going to be talking about how companies are currently performing based on disclosures to CDP and next steps the Global Stocktake could propose for non-state actors.
Thank you very much, and I'm really glad to be here. Although I am a little bit angry, in 11 years in the process, I haven't kept a single pin except for Together for Transparency, which I now forgot in the hotel, which is annoying. It's going to be a slightly different presentation to the others because civil society is something we all know and love, as is benchmarking is something that's very useful to us. Explaining and making CDP sexy is like looking at the motherboard inside your iPhone and trying to explain a conversation on that. So forgive me for explaining a little bit about CDP. It ties in very much with the concept of ambition loops that Sabrina had mentioned earlier on. So we had a little discussion about which presentation to have here. Usually we have a demented smiley that looks like he's on acid to explain our theory of change. But I'll explain a little bit of what we are and what we do and then how it ties into the Global Stocktake, if I may, and I'll try and do it fast. At the beginning, in 2000, CDP used to ask on a single A4 page investors to request environmental data and impact data from companies. This has grown over time, definitely from a single A4 page. It's now 191 pages. The point, though, was that investors would make the request, and they trust us or a stakeholder engagement process that we went through and do go through on an annual basis to ask what that data is. And we'll get back to the complexity of data in a minute. The same is now asked by companies and Race to Zero and the champions in the future. Those investors make that request, the data is provided, and then provided publicly where at all possible. That creates an impact and hopefully moves, not only creating an impact, but moves from a race to the bottom, which was in the past the direction things were going, to a race to the top. Oh, you can see me now. Well, then let me be beautiful for you, essentially, is how that was meant to work. Currently, we get requests from over 740 financial institutions managing over $130 trillion in assets. We have 18,000, nobody's going to quote me on this, I think it's 700 and not 600, 18,700 corporates reporting to us, over 1,100 cities, states, and regions, worth over 50%. I'm sorry, I told you it would be like a motherboard, so I'm trying to bombard you with the numbers at the beginning and stop there. Worth over 50% of the global market capitalization. They are meant, in the way that our theory of change works, to create a leading tip of the spear. A lot in terms of, obviously, the impact itself and in the data that comes in. So, I'm also, by the way, I don't know who determined the order of us speaking, but it's brilliant. Thank you very much for presenting ACT. That actually does quite a lot of the work. We do a lot of the back-end research of ACT for oil and gas, and it's a partnership that we're very, very proud of, and I think is the outward-facing element of CDP. So, why is CDP, or why at all? I think we know why we're engaging with the Global Stocktake. I'd be surprised if anyone in this room isn't aware of that particular element. There's a reversal of the way we think about it. So the Global Stocktake should be those three things. It should be purpose-driven, inclusive, and evidence-based. But there's a reasoning in the why for it. It has to be purpose-driven. It has to have an actual impact on the environment. It has to encourage equity, and therefore, it needs to be evidence-based. Also, therefore, it must be inclusive, also for it to be evidence-based. These are inherently linked to each other. They require a cooperation, and the theory of change goes onward and onward. I think nobody here would be surprised to hear that nation-states are an artificial being, as are corporates, exactly as Sabrina said, and exactly as Maureen said. We are all in charge of achieving the Paris Agreement goals, all of them. And therefore, that inclusion is important. Non-state actors then need to be included for accuracy, but also for enhancing their ambition. I think that's very clear and self-explanatory, but also incredibly hard in a process like the UNFCCC, but also incredibly hard in the context of trying to get action along with precise data. And we'll get to the concept of greenwashing, but I think to build on what Marine said, if the global stocktake works, then it's impactful. If it's impactful, then we all need a voice. But if we all need a voice, then we all need for it to work in an effective way, and that goes back to the accountability framework presented and that we're very excited to take part in. Last slide, and I will finish for now. Again, following on my colleagues and Joachim and also what Marine said, a common roadmap. A common roadmap is what the global stocktake needs to provide. We all know the concept of a fair share, whether in these negotiations or in what a corporate should do. Even if unnamed most polluting company in the world stopped polluting tomorrow, as many of them should, the climate crisis will not be resolved. There's always the question of each company, each village, each country with its fair share. But that needs alignment. It needs alignment between what the IPCC says, to what a country needs to do, to what a corporate needs to do, to what we need to demand from that corporate. And what we need to demand from the corporate cannot be expected from every person to understand. Therefore, the global stocktake and its results provide that common roadmap for both action and ultimately for financial flows. Agreeing again with those before me, I call them HLEG for so long, the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero Emission Commitments to Non-State Entities, and I challenge you all to say that 10 times fast. HLEG recommendations are brilliant in that they are broad and wide. They are 10 recommendations, they encompass everything. They are broad enough to encompass local issues, exactly as Joachim just said, but they are also specific enough to not allow much of greenwashing to happen. I will add a sort of ad-lib point, and there are enough of my team here to potentially kill me for adding something outside of the slides. There's an element of flexibility to the accountability framework and to everything else, and that is one of the most vital elements that there are. Ambition is going to change, our understanding of what's required is going to change, and we need to remember that, and therefore this inclusion needs to be systemized. For something that science-based targets are vital, transition plans are vital, disclosure is vital. Those are the recommendations. And I would say that they apply to all environmental impacts, not just to climate, and I'm happy to get to that a little bit later. So I've spoken a lot about the motherboard in our phones. I'm very happy to continue and perhaps answer questions a bit later. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amir. And we will come back to many of the points that you have raised. So finally, I'm going to hand over to Antoine, who has led for 5 years the publication of the annual Global Synthesis Reports on Climate Action. And he's going to cover moving from transparency to impact assessment and the kind of views of local actors.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. Speaking with you about how we can extend the concept of accountability to all non-state actors, including businesses, but also talking about local governments at regional and city level. This is the old me. I was younger, but this is the old me with shorter hair. I'd just like to start with a figure. 36.8 gigaton of CO2 were emitted in 2022. I just like to remember this figure all the time because every year it gets even bigger. So it means that we're definitely off track right now. So after that, we can speak of everything, but we are off track of our targets, and this will continue if we stay off track on transition pathway and do not hold actors accountable for their impact regarding their commitments, voluntary commitments. So climate change was built on the premises that to reach these targets, we need to build bridges and break silos between all non-state actors. We need to put local governments, businesses, NGOs, and all the constituencies around the same table and learn to speak the same language. And we are doing so through 3 types of missions: sharing information, analyzing action through the observatory, but also united actors. We were born out of a summit held in 2016 in Nantes, France, which are meant to create a common dynamic, and we are active in Europe and Africa. So as for the observatory, we've been tracking for 5 years the results that are available throughout the literature, reports, think tanks, academics, press reviews, and we try to make a synthesis of all that in annual reports that we publish just right before the COPs and even more. Because we do believe in inspiration by example. So we think that policymakers, climate plan leaders and citizens do not need only forecasts, commitments, scenarios. They need to see what happened in the past to understand the present. Where are we and where do we come from? So that's the modest contribution we try to do throughout these reports. And I will lean on this, this work to introduce some of the gaps we have identified in cities, emission, and accountability in general. First, the underreporting challenge. Some studies have used, this is a growing scientific field, ground sensors, local data sets, and satellite observations to pinpoint gaps with statistical inventory reports, which shows that there are sometimes an underestimation of emissions. This is important for accuracy and ambition, as Amir said, that we are very aware that the local governments work with the proper data that will help to make the right decisions. Second, the boundary challenge. Consumption-based emission of 94 of the biggest cities throughout the world account for 10% of global emissions, and 85% of these consumption-based emissions are sourced outside of the city boundaries, which means that cities that represent nearly 70% of emissions at global level also need to connect to the territories, to connect to different actors to understand where are the sources of their emissions and how they can deal with it. And last, the time lag challenge. This is an example, the EU Covenant of Mayors, which gather nearly more than 8,000 mayors, I think, throughout Europe. Some analysis of the reporting data has shown that the average latest monitoring emissions inventory in 2020 dates back to 2014. This is the time of a mayor mandate in France, which means that your policymakers is not playing with the right data when it makes the decision. So we need to be more ambitious about that, and we need to encourage these actors to do even more and provide them with the proper tools and understanding of the science and instruments out there availability. So from that, I would like just to stress how it is urgent to shift from transparency to accountability. We are in a constrained environment with geopolitical pressure around the climate transition, and we need to be accountable of our impact as companies, local governments, and others. Right now, we have many reporting standards that are being prepared or maybe disentangled, especially in Europe with the CSRD. We need to raise the bar to double materiality. What I mean is companies should identify the impact of climate change upon their business, but they should also identify the impact of their business upon climate change if they want to be credible with their targets. The GST and MPGCA shall balance the ambition cycle with stronger accounting requirements, but we've seen that the framework is maybe providing that. So hopefully this is going in the right way. We also encourage parties, because the UNFCCC cannot do anything, and either the HLC. So we need the parties really to better integrate non-party stakeholders in transition plans and regulatory policies. Joachim said it before, and then we need to keep track and progress through data-based analysis. I would say, for the last word, that global stocktake is a philosophy. It is much more than an institutional mechanism. It is a philosophy, and it needs to be extended throughout all actors on this boat. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Antoine, and all of our panelists here. So we're now going to move to the panel discussion, and we'd be interested to take some questions from the audience in a moment. Before we do, one of the things that you have just emphasized is obviously the urgency. And we've been talking about this in the kind of the business context. And actually, I think I'm going to come to Amir first to ask you a question in terms of, we need more companies to be not only setting out pledges, but also setting out their transition plans and therefore showing and being accountable for actually the pledges they've made. So what are some of the kind of the key barriers and enablers to encourage more companies to actually do that?
start with me with a thin red line to walk across. Let's start with what the state is of what companies are doing and what we're talking about. The word greenwashing was waved around, and anyone who has ever seen me speak knows that I'm going to say a controversial thing, which is that I love greenwashing. It means that something's important enough to lie about. But it's also a never-ending cycle. We don't all greenwash on purpose. The question is what type of data you know how to provide, how to do so in a harmonized way. So in many, many cases where mistakenly, exactly as was just pointed out, where mistakenly, potentially, under-reporting, over-reporting, sideways reporting, and triple reporting. And there's a need for clarity of what correct reporting is. And I would argue that harmonization in this instance, whether it's ESRS, ESRD, SEC, ISSB, or Indian BSRS, or anything else that might be coming from any other country, is more important than the content of them at this stage, because civil society and all of us need to be able to inspect what a stream of data is. The biggest barrier is that nobody knows what the correct data is. There's again, anyone who's heard me speak, there's the angels and devils theory. There's 20% are angels and we don't need to help them, they're going to do their best. 20% are devils and not worth the effort right now. And 60% just honestly want to know what to do. And for those 60%, that's where the impact lies. So it's guidance. And just to say, our data has a precise 12-year lag. So this is data that is from the last day of COP26. And the next cycle is coming out in 2 months. But at that point, 4,100 companies had a 1.5 aligned target. But only 81 of them had what we would define, and we've been defining for a few years, as a credible transition plan. And it's important to keep that somewhat, I'd say, horrifying stat, but also not so terrible, because if you look at the next category down with many, you also have about 2,500 companies. And at that stage, when the concept of transition plan came about 18 months before that, that is not a terrible level of movement. 6,520 say that they plan to have one, and I ask everyone in this room to keep their eye on them to ensure they have now 1 year to do that. But the reason I brought all of those stats, and I know I promised to stop with numbers, is that regulation helps. Even the shadow of the UK Transition Plan Task Force ensured that compared to 0.4% of the grand total having a credible transition plan, 28% of reporting companies in the UK did. First of all, I'm not from the UK despite the accent, so this is not national loyalty. This is just to say it's the only impact measure that we have. In assessments from CDP, 33%, let's say 33, it's either 32 or 33%, state their biggest fear in terms of risks as legislation, not litigation, not any. They don't care how harsh the rules are, as long as there are rules and they are certain. So the Global Stocktake, by creating that common line, would allow to address one of the biggest barriers, which is that mess that was just mentioned. Do I follow this? Do I account for it in that way? Do I do so in a different way? And at the same time, it would allow us to do so in a scientific manner, theoretically in its ideal form. And I would argue that it is the only pathway to allow for an equitable transition to any of these elements, because it must include that stakeholder engagement, not at the company level. That needs to be enforced at the international level where possible. And I understand that there are discussions of sovereignty to your non-state actors, but that is the only way to ensure that. I'll stop here. Sorry for that question.
That's okay. I mean, it's interesting, actually, the stats you mentioned, because you're mentioning the companies that are already committed and pledged, but actually there's many more who haven't that we actually need to bring into this process, and that is also a very important part of it, which is where I think, Joachim, you mentioned about mandatory disclosures and, obviously in relation to what Amir was saying about the role of governments. I mean, what do you see as the role of governments in supporting businesses to engage in the global stocktake, but also to be more transparent, to publish those those transition plans, but also thinking about the data as well and actually what they actually publish?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So I think there's two elements here, and Amir touched on the importance of the disclosure requirements as a key aspect for these companies to also develop more credible transition plans. But also I think what's important to keep in mind is also the sectoral specificities of the companies operating in these sectors, and beyond disclosure as well, how can sectoral legislation push these companies to either invest more or align more with the type of change that we want to see. So I think here it's interesting to think about some of the changes that are happening. It could be EU or other in terms of how do you price more your environmental externalities in terms of shipping, or build the supply and the demand for alternative fuels. What are the concrete levers that you can have there? So I think it's also about these disclosure requirements, but it's also about sector-specific legislation. And also, I think there's also the convening of these companies where they can have exchange of practices between themselves as well, which can be a key area too, as, in terms of, for example, the national oil companies in sharing what are the types of technologies to decarbonize, but there needs to be more supervisory responsibility from policymakers to see how that actually translates into change, and that it's not just engagement for the sake of engagement.
Brilliant, thank you. And I mean, you're talking about national level governments. Antoine, you were talking about cities. And I think it's quite interesting to think about businesses operate on many different levels. There are many different sized businesses. We're mostly talking about the larger corporates. Small and medium enterprises are also very important in terms of particularly the supply chains that you're referring to and kind of the beyond city emissions. But I think, how do you see the interaction between, some of those local non-state actors and businesses working to actually enable that, and support that transparency?
Good question. The thing is, I'd say companies who wish to accelerate their contribution to the global transition, because actually this is not the transition of the company that matters the most, that's the transition of the global energy system and societies. These companies need to work hand in hand with local elected people on responsibility. If they want to drive a just transition, because as you might see, the European Union, the US are, in so many other countries, are developing lots of transition plans that are based on new resources that need to be extracted, new ways of imagining our jobs, new ways of organizing the industry at the territorial level. So if you want to have a transition that is that works for everyone and that leaves no one behind, as we say, I think one of the key is this articulation between businesses and local governments. I take, for example, all the projects of mines that were supposed to be open on the European territory and that were finally cancelled because the people do not want any mine on their territory. But mine and lithium, cobalt, nickel are needed for the transition of transport, for instance. So transparency will also help to engage the local communities because they will have the data, they will have the facts to understand where are we, where do we come from, so they will be even more ready to work hand in hand with companies to go further and find common basis to cooperate and maybe accelerate the transition and mitigation.
Fantastic. And you talked there very much around almost the implementation level. And I think that was, Marina, when you were talking, you actually talked about how can the process support implementation. I think I'd be interested to hear a bit more from you on that, because we now, Sabrina was mentioning the need for action, and we're very much into the, how do we implement this? How do we accelerate that implementation? So how do you think processes such as the Global Stocktake, which are fostering transparency and accountability, can also support that implementation?
Thanks. It's quite interesting to see that we link a UN process, a UN body, with non-state actors. Actually, it's not a UN sphere. Normally, it's mostly parties. So why is UNFCCC now? Why do we talk about UNFCCC and non-state actors accountability? And I think it's always nice to remember that It's because it's the Paris Agreement spirit. We decided in 2015 that everyone in the society should engage. Everyone is on board. So from there, what is positive is that we saw a lot of engagement from societies next to parties. Since 2015, if some of you were in older COPs, you can see how the people are different today. We have much more engagement, and that's great. So this call has been heard, but now we are realizing, as you said, this is not enough. We don't need only community around it and commitments, we need action. And I think the global stocktake is probably the main mechanism for non-state action, because we have others in the Paris Agreement who are meant to create transparency, etc. But the GST is the one where we are meant to take stock and also propose the next solutions for the next years to reach our targets. So, for example, if we take back the accountability framework, let's say the GST is mandating this framework to be strengthened, to be implemented in the coming years. That would be interesting, at least for us to know how, but also, you know, next to having a framework in the UNFCCC on how to track non-state action, it's also about what happens if the results are bad. What happens if we have a company or if we have an initiative reporting, but the results are bad? Does that mean that, for example, this actor does not have the right to take the floor, I don't know, on a UNFCCC event? Or does that mean that you don't have access to a pavilion? Like, you can't have a pavilion if you are not a climate champion. It's a bit maybe provocative what I'm saying, but that would be interesting to have this mandate from the GST to really think about, if we have a framework on non-state action, what does that mean in terms of UNFCCC process rules? Does that mean also maybe we need a concrete policy against conflict of interest in the UNFCCC? That will be also a recommendation. At least we would like to work on this. So I think there could be several tools to use after the GST to really go in the implementation. And implementation is not going without accountability. So I think this could be interesting to link this to. And my last maybe comment, we are asking a lot to the UNFCCC, and it's great, we have to. But as it was said before, the UNFCCC has its limits, and it's not the place to regulate companies or cities. It doesn't have the mandate to force them to communicate. So there is a lot on transparency and implementation for non-state action that is happening at the national level with national regulation. So that's another topic. We could do a whole other side event on this, but I just wanted to remind that actually there is not only the UNFCCC scale to create more accountability, there is also, and actually it's a very important one, there is also the national scale where that would be interesting to really think about what tools parties, both from the north and the south, because these are not the same conditions, which tool could be used to raise up accountability. Thank you.
Definitely, and what you taught there in some ways is the incentives to act and actually the disincentives as well not to act, and that's the thing, it's important that people are making those changes, that we're seeing the transition plans, that we're seeing those actions kind of be accelerated. Now, I'd be interested, I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. Don't know if anyone does want to ask something, there's one here. If we can just wait for the microphone, sorry, it's just coming, just to make sure we can hear you.
Hi, thank y'all. I have kind of a two-part question. So first, what investments and actions are needed to overcome the challenges to data and reporting that y'all mentioned? And then two, how do you envision this data being used to actually hold non-state actors accountable?
I think we take one more question. I think there was just behind you, and then we'll ask, and then we'll take a couple, and then, so there's just one there, and then we'll put those to the panel, and then we'll ask the next round.
Hi, thank you. My name is Adriana from a firm based in Spain called Climate Strategy, and we've been carrying out efforts to accelerate the decarbonization of small, medium enterprises, but also supporting them, right, on disclosing climate information, calculating their carbon footprint, as most of them have not. More than 2/3 have not calculated it, and they do represent more than 50% of emissions, at least in Spain, but the numbers are similar in other European countries. And the levers and barriers they face are very different from large companies, so they're not subject to regulatory pressures like large companies are, but they are subject to the pressures that these large companies put on them for themselves to be accountable to regulatory pressures, right? So it's an indirect impact. And the barriers they face are lack of finance and lack of knowledge of all these guidelines you've mentioned on reporting, climate target setting, right? So they don't have the knowledge for this. So my question is, what kind of specific insights do you have about these non-state actors? How can we support them? How can we include them in these discussions? How can we track better their consumption of energy and other kind of resource-intensive SMEs? How can we track better their progress in decarbonization? And also, how can we make large companies support them as their small suppliers, right? As they manage the environmental impact of their supply chain. How can we make a large company not just require them to be more green, but also support them in this transformation? Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Who would like to take the first question, Amir?
I was politely waiting for anyone else, but I see. I'll tie the two questions in together, but I'll start with the second one because I think it ties into the first. There is a statistic we have something called a supply chain program at CDP. Sorry, it's not a sales pitch in any way, but I know CDP, so that's the way that I answer. 96% of supply chain members make requirements of their suppliers. 4% tell them how to meet those requirements. It's not malevolence, it's lack of knowledge. If we want to know how, then we have to harmonize legitimate requests. So the United States recently released an executive order. I'm far from knowledgeable of the American legal system and how long it'll take it to actually be implemented, but that critical suppliers of the federal government, worth $630 billion a year, must report, and they gave, whether it's CDP and SBTI or whether it's anything else, without sort of being mission-driven and not my own organization-driven, when you give a condition, then that condition should only be incentivized if the means to achieve it are there. Part of the money that is required, you asked how much money, and that would be a wild guess on my part, how much money, but I can say what the money is needed for. There is something called an SME hub. We also have an SME questionnaire, but without a shadow of a doubt, the biggest chunk of money that's required is for capacity building in a lot of them. Absolutely big firms, big companies, they have their pathways and their knowledge, and absolutely there's a big chunk of money that's required for technical means to store the data, to clean the data, and to present the data. But absolutely for supply chains, and if we want to avoid, it's not my role, I feel I'm taking the role of other people at the table, but if we want to avoid financial colonialism to a large extent, supply chain needs to have, there has to be concepts of a credible, equitable divestment where required, and there has to be capacity building for the whole supply chain, so conditions for that. So in terms of money, those to me are many of the solutions. So one is capacity building, second is technical, literal platforms to collect what will inevitably be a massive amount of data. But third is also an understanding, I truly believe that technology should make my life easier and I should be lying on a beach always with a cocktail, but I don't see that happening, is that we can't remember there is a human element. What we identify this year, even for the biggest company in the world to do, they will next year benevolently, by mistake, do something else, or malevolently find a way to get around it. Science will evolve. Unfortunately, there are locked-in results. Our climate will evolve. Technology will evolve. The questions that need asking and the data that needs gathering needs to be more than data. It needs to be information. And that is a complicated process that can't be, I forget the idiom in English, but a one-fix trick. It's not done once. Hence, I recommended the adaptability before. So you have to have a mechanism that can actually adapt to, I was asking about this year, but next year I'm going to be asking you about, I guess, critical minerals, which were mentioned earlier, and so I'll shut up and let others answer other elements.
Brilliant. Would others like to come in on these questions? I don't think we've covered quite the investment bit yet in terms of the first question.
Not necessarily just money, but like actions, infrastructure, like
So
say,
just to clarify, yeah, it's around the actions and the, what is needed overall.
just to say green taxonomies and alignment of green taxonomies and understand of what sustainable finance means. What does sustainable finance mean when it comes to adaptation? It's very different for non-state actors than it is for state actors, as was mentioned by, I think, every single one of my colleagues on the panel. Harmonization, again, would be an issue. How do you understand what a sustainable investment is in Brazil and in Chad, and how that goes or doesn't go across the barrier of the carbon border adjustment mechanism? Those understandings and incorporating them in terms of investment would be required.
Regarding how to help smaller actors to deal with their data challenges, I witness in the country I live in, France, a springing environment of new small businesses that are providing software solutions easily accessible, sometimes even open source, for companies, but also locals, elected people, to find out what is their carbon footprint in a very easy way. And I think this is helping a lot, because this is making making carbon footprint accounting much more familiar to policymakers and investors, but also smaller company leaders. So I think this new environment is quite interesting. There are many companies that I'm sure that you will meet here, because they're always searching for new companies to convince to measure their emissions, and how big companies can help them. I mean, if you take a look at the financial results of an oil major, for instance, you will see that most of its results are going to their stakeholders. It's not even going into new investment. It's mostly going to stakeholders. If you have that money, then you can also help your supply chain.
And maybe another element on this, as I said, I think still, for example, the guidance we mentioned will still be very far away from these kind of actors. Even if the UNFCCC is getting, more and more visible, and we will have maybe we are coming in the 2 years on that, I guess it will still be very far from the ground. So I would suggest here again, that's also the role of parties to support their smaller companies, and to put in place some mechanism where they can be supported and where they can receive capacity building. So I would say here there is an interesting path for advocacy at the national level from companies to ask for support, because I think this is the duty of the parts of the country to support the development of smaller organizations or companies. And maybe on the first questions, I like the question how data can be really held non-state actors accountable, because when you have a whole Excel sheet or whatsoever with a lot of numbers, and you're like, okay, right, what we do with that? Here I see also the role of civil society. I think it's also the role of organizations like us to use when the data are public, that's also our role to make it understandable. And that's also our role to come out and say, oh, look, thanks to this data, we could see these and these champions, but we could also see these and these. So I think this is where we all have to work together, because that's our work. That's what we do every day. We see data, or we see very hard policy text, and we transform them to recommendation and tangible ask. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that I think civil society has a role to play to really make non-state actors accountable, thanks to the data we have access to.
And I think building on that, I mean, the bit you're asking around investment, I think investment is actually quite a key question at the moment in terms of actually how you unlock investment, particularly if you look at some of the smaller and the medium enterprises, local areas, developing countries, where is the investment needed, and actually where is it actually going, are two very different things. And I think that's, there's lots of conversations obviously here around finance, the financial flows, but I think there is a role for parties to actually support non-state actors in relation to that. And some of that is actually the policy certainty, helping to shift markets, helping to shift whole sectors. Because actually when it comes in connecting to what you're saying about the small and medium enterprises, they're not going to be able to shift without bigger businesses shifting. And they may be able to do it for one, but they won't necessarily be able to do it if, if they're supplying to more than one and the others are still wanting kind of business as usual, then how do they shift and how do they know they've got that certainty to shift? And I think that's where it comes down to that national level, local level, and actually how do we get those shifts there in terms of the implementation that's needed. I can see another hand raising, and I'm aware of time, so I think we'll take a couple more questions if we can. I think there was a hand, sorry, I think there was one over there, if there's still a question over there as well.
Hi, mine is actually not a question. I just wanted to build on what's just been said, if you allow me. I don't want to steal the panel's thunder, but I'm Pamela Jouven. I'm the director of the SME Climate Hub. I just wanted to add a couple of comments. So in terms of the barriers that SMEs face, we conduct annual surveys across our community to understand that, and I can confirm education is definitely the first barrier. The second one is the lack of capacity, and the third one, of course, the lack of funding. In terms of resources that are made available to SMEs, well, of course, the SME Climate Hub, of course, I need to say it is a first port of call. There are a lot of free tools and resources, but I totally agree that at local level, there's a lot that's happening. Antoine mentioned France. As a matter of fact, BPI France in France has its own Climate Hub that is providing, there again, a lot of free tools and resources. And we're seeing in other countries such as the UK, where the UK government is very much involved, that, again, guidance is being made available to local SMEs. And then in terms of how to collect data, and thanks, Amir, for mentioning us, we jointly developed a disclosure framework with CDP a couple of years ago that is now being implemented. We recently launched our own reporting tool that is available on the hub, but I know that CDP are working on their own SME questionnaire, once again, to make sure that we can collect data from these SMEs, including through supply chains. And maybe that's the last comment that I'll make about supply chain engagement. We're seeing in our own network that a lot of corporates are now looking to engage their SME suppliers. The same applies to financial institutions, financial actors, banks, and that does require collaboration between the different stakeholders that we mentioned. But once again, I think that with CDP, the hub, and other actors, we're really trying to take a joint approach to engage these big corporate buyers and other financial actors. Thank you.
Thank you, and certainly I think there has been a real shift, but still, I think there's still a challenge actually around how we get SMEs. How does the process relate to them? And actually, how do we therefore engage? And certainly, I mean, I've only been to, I think, one COP where we've had a couple of SMEs actually there. There's very few that actually attend any of these processes or engage in them because of that, that capacity. So we're kind of quite vital as well in that role of actually how do we, translate that down into what they need to do. Were there any further questions? I think I did see a hand up over that side before. If not, there, if you want to take that.
Hi, my name is Tatiana. I'm a doctoral researcher, and I'm researching exactly how cities participate at the UNFCCC process. And through the years, when I research this topic, I'm always questioning myself how, in general, this communication between UNFCCC and non-party stakeholders is going on. As Anton has mentioned the analogy between kind of philosophy, that global stocktake is more like a philosophy. I also see that probably the whole communication between UNFCCC and non-party stakeholders is more like a philosophy. But maybe I'm mistaken, and what you represent, each of you represent the expert community, right, which somehow communicates with UNFCCC. Maybe aside these panel discussions, there is still institutionalized or not non-institutionalized communication. And do you know if there is any progress in this building communication, and if the parties actually are interested to receive the data that you collect, and yeah, what is going on there between these layers? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take that?
Thank you. Just regarding cities, this is my fourth. I've participated to 4 COPs, and as long as I remember, then I've always met with the LGMA people with the intent to just write local governments in the final decision, and It never happens. So you can do as many dialogues as you want, but as long as the parties do not want to, because this is a common space for all countries of the world with different cultures, with different relationship, with decentralization, this institutionalized sphere cannot do everything. So I think the non-institutional dialogue is super important as well, and the fact that the LGMA people do exist in this room. They do not exist in the final paper, maybe, but they exist in the room, and they exist as also policymakers who can make a difference with their regulatory, with their public spendings, and they can do many things. So this is also what we were just saying before. We should not expect too much out of this the process. This is also national matters, and national things should happen at the national level with dialogues with the actors. And as Amir said, the data needs to be transformed into information. Without the information, without the story that comes with, the data is unuseful for the policymakers at the party level.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, just I'd like to come to each of you in turn to kind of think about, in terms of closing thoughts, you know, we talk about the urgency and the need to actually move forward on this. Obviously, there is the process that will be continuing through to COP, but what one action do you think is vital to happen ahead of COP in relation to the non-state actor role in the global stocktake and, you know, how we drive accountability and action? Amir, I'll start with you and then come this way, if that's all right.
That was unfair. What is the one vital thing that needs to happen? It's not, I mean, harmonization, of course, what the UN Secretary General requested under the recommendations, harmonization of the initiatives and understanding of what the process to get all of the information that is comparable so that civil society and others can actually make use of it. Absolutely. If I would be asked about a specific thing, what's the one thing that would tip the scales? If you would have an agreement, it doesn't have to be perfect, on one way to assess risk and on the need to do so in a localized fashion, everything else, I think, would stream from there. The capacity building, the analysis of whether it's the best method, and then taking it apart and then rebuilding it. But that would be the one thing for me.
Maybe I can just quickly react to the SME question because I didn't get a chance. So just to briefly say that while we benchmark keystone companies, there's also a project at WBA to look beyond these companies. So I think when we talk about SMEs, there's a wide range of actors. You could have really small companies, medium-sized companies, and so on. So the idea is to see how our methodologies can then be used for these companies as well. So I'm not specifically working myself on that project, but just to say that I completely agree with that. This is also an area that needs to be assessed. In terms of what would be important to see from non-state actor action for the global stocktake, I mean, for a project that we're currently doing, I think it's important to see where is this going, because we're seeing a growing amount of initiatives in Race to Zero or other portals, but the credibility of how these initiatives are going to deliver and the type of support they need for their members to align with what the objectives of the initiatives are isn't totally clear. So how do they differentiate themselves? So I think that's an area which would really be important to reinforce the value added of all these initiatives that we're currently seeing, rather than seeing a multiplicity of more and more initiatives happening, really strengthening those that currently exist. Thank you.
And I'll choose the negotiations that will go on the global stocktake, where we know now the political phase is starting. So it means parties have to decide on the key political recommendations the stocktake will send for the next NDC round. And for me, what they have to work on until COP28 is what is the 3 lines we want on non-state action in the UNFCCC, and how to create more transparency and accountability and be sure that there is a mandate to the UNFCCC team to be able to do their work correctly. So for me, if we are coming to COP28 with already some even draft decisions with these 3 lines, to me this is already a nice way to start.
As for me, shifting from transparency to action and turning data into proper initiatives is also, as I said before, in the hands of individual states. The global stocktake is a collective assessment of the progress, and they're not so good, I can tell you that. So individually, the states need to make sure that there are consequences after they get the data. I just take, for example, when Joe Biden announces that he will ask companies with accessing to public markets to deliver their Scope 3 emissions. I haven't read any consequences if there are bad results or no evolution. So there need to be consequences to the transparency and accountability system we provide, and this is in the hand of the parties to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you also to the audience for the questions. I mean, certainly we'll be coming to COP28 to be able to share some of what businesses are doing and the way that they're actually implementing it, and some of the transition plans that they're developing, and actually but also to discuss the barriers and the opportunities for going further and accelerating action. If you want to find out anything, kind of follow up with us, please do so, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.